In today's video, we're going to break down the Bullet MG for potential service and repair. Now, before we get started, you're going to need a small screwdriver set. In this exact instance, the Autocraft tool set, which I think I bought at AutoZone, worked out real nice. There's a flat-headed Phillips screwdriver. I'll show a close-up picture of that. That worked out the best with the main body screws of the reel. Other things you might need is a pan with raised walls, that way it can catch any parts that fly off the reel. I used a rubber band as well to secure my line to the spool, that way it's not unraveling and getting all over the place. A tackle box works out very nicely to sort parts by their subgroups. So for example, if I have a pinion gear with 2 retaining screws, I'll take that pinion gear and the 2 retaining screws and put it in its own little compartment in the tackle box. That way when I go back to assemble the reel, I'm not confused as to where these small screws go. Alright, without wasting any more time, let's just get right into it. Alright, there's our Zebco Bullet MG. What we're going to do is press the thumb button. That's going to release the pickup pins. Actually, it retracts the pickup pins into the spinner head assembly and allows you to unscrew the front cover. So unscrew the front cover assembly, that pops off, reveals the spinner head, and there's some loose line, so that's where my rubber band comes in handy, and that'll just secure the line to the spool. That way it doesn't unravel and get all over the place. Next, we're going to get a good grip on our handle assembly, and what that does is it allows us to put some resistance on the spinner head. It'll break its tension and then it'll just unscrew right on off. Now we're looking at our bearing retainer slash bushing for the pinion gear. So right hand turning, we'll unscrew it or loosen it up, and that reveals the spinner head bearing. So that bearing pops right on off, and then we have our spool. To help take the spool off, tighten the drag down all the way. I think that puts resistance on the pinion gear assembly and allows you to twist off the spool. So right to remove, and you have arrows there on top of the spool to help you out. And there's the back side of the spool in case you're wondering. Alright, there's the drag gear, which is in the way of our main body screws, so we just twist the drag back in the opposite direction until voila, the main gear or the drag gear is no longer blocking our main body screws. In my humble opinion, the main body screws of the MG are inferior to the older body screws of the conventional Bullet. If you look at the 2 different screws, you can see that the MG has wider threads and the interface for the screwdriver is much smaller. Now those wider threads, I would imagine, is so that it stays tight with the new plastic back cover. That back cover used to be metal on the conventional Bullet, and that's why the threads of the main screws of the old Bullet are much tighter and precise. Now with the old one, with a much larger screwdriver interface, you can get a lot more torque and a lot more twisting power. So in my humble opinion, these new screws are garbage and they're very prone to stripping. So make sure you have the right Phillips screwdriver in order to back those out. Or you're going to do what I did and try a whole bunch of different screwdrivers, and they just keep stripping the heads out because there's just so much tension between those wide threads and the plastic back cover. Alright, so once we back out the main body screws, the plastic back cover comes off the back of the reel, and then you can see there the drag wheel just fell on out. No big deal, we'll just store that. Alright, so there's our spool carrier assembly. It is attached to the main gear with a flathead screw. Right there I'm shaking out the main body screws that haven't fallen out yet. And then my roller clutch, which is the +1 bearing on the pinion gear, fell off as well. So we can just store all those items. Alright, next I'm going to take my multi-tool and unscrew the cap for the crank rod nut. That pops off, and then you have a brass crank rod nut. And that's pretty much keeping your shaft for your handle assembly attached to the reel. So that pops off. That's what that crank rod nut looks like. Boom. We can store that. And now our handle assembly should pull right on out. There's that shaft that crank rod nut was attached to. And there is a castle nut, which is a bearing retainer. So I'm going to take a flathead, I'm going to put it into one of the notches and turn counterclockwise, and that castle nut will back on out. Now, if you're doing this for the first time, that might be a little tight from the factory. So it might not be as easy as what I'm showing there. Alright, now we can probably unscrew our spool carrier assembly from the main gear, but first in the video I'm removing one of the bearings, the handle and main gear. What I do is I take that flathead and I just kind of like apply pressure evenly around the bearing until it walks its way out of the frame there. And I don't want to like twerk it too hard on one side because I don't want to side load it too much. Alright, so there is the nut or screw that connects the spool carrier to the oscillator, which is like a crosswind block in a spinner. So a little nut comes out. Now the oscillator will be free of the little foot there coming down from the spool carrier assembly. Boom. So there's our main gear. We kind of shake it on out. There's a washer, so be sure not to lose that washer, and that's on the handle side. Or wherever your oscillator is going to end up, that washer should be there as well. So the oscillator pops off, and then there's our all aluminum forged main gear, which used to be brass in the old reel. Alright, so we got one more bearing left in the frame, so there you can see there with the screwdriver I just kind of apply equal pressure on opposite sides and just kind of walk it out of the frame. Might be tight in there. Cool. Now the spool carrier assembly should be free and it just pops right on out. And that's the new spool carrier assembly on the Bullet MG, and it's plastic. Next we can unscrew the pinion gear retainer nuts. And what I'm doing is I adjust the reel body so that when the screws fall out, they get caught by the body. And then there's our pinion gear with its respective bearing. Now at this point you're probably done. What I'm about to do is probably going to be excessive. You don't need to do, but we're just going to remove the drag clicker. And it just has a little retaining screw, and there's a little plunger that'll plop out. And there I am using the frame as a net essentially for catching screws that fall off. We'll shake the plunger out. It's just a little metal body with a spring on the back side, and that just goes in this little housing. And it's kind of difficult. Sometimes it's easy, but you can just walk your screwdriver around and press out this little plastic ring here. It's not really a seal, it's just kind of a spacer really. And boom, there you go, you have a stripped magnesium body. Alright, at this point, this is probably as far as you need to go in terms of breaking down your reel for annual service and cleaning. If you really use this real hard, maybe every 6 months. I am going to show you guys how to break down the spool carrier assembly, which is allows you access to your drag washers, which is a nice feature over the old Bullet. But yeah, let's just get right into it. Alright, now we can put that plastic retainer or spacer back in the drag wheel housing area. There's our little clicker. It's basically a plunger with a spring on the backside. There's little grooves on the backside of your drag wheel, and as you're turning your drag wheel, that little plunger makes clicking noises. And there's our little retaining screw, so we'll just tighten that down. I like to get it started with a Phillips, and then I bust out the flathead, I believe, in this scenario, and tighten it down. There's our pinion gear assembly. We'll just drop that down in the housing. Make sure the respective bearing is flush to the housing, just like that. And what I like to do with these screws is I like to throw them inside the body there, kind of hold the whole body level, and then walk it over to its hole. So I don't have the smallest hands in the world, so as you can see here I'm struggling a little bit, but I just kind of walk it over into the hole, and then I rock it over and send it home with the Phillips. Like I said earlier, I like to get them all started with the Phillips, and then I'll finish them off with the flathead. That way I'm not stripping out the screws. There we go. There's our pinion gear back home. Alright, let's move over to the spool carrier assembly. You have 4 screws, so just back out those 4 screws, and the top of the spool carrier assembly will come off, and that's what it looks like inside. Not sure what we want to call that, maybe a pinion gear housing thingamajig that holds our drag washers. And then what I like to do is, as I'm taking my drag washers off, I like to line them up in my tray as they came out and in the appropriate orientation. So they just come on out. I kind of wish Zebco would beef up their drag system a little bit, especially on this reel. I mean, they could go to a carbon material like Penn does and a lot of other manufacturers. They can really upgrade it. Here's our main drag gear. You can pop that off, lube it up, service it. It has little ramps on the back. Kind of applies more pressure to your drag washers. And then there's the little gear that interfaces with your drag wheel. Kind of like the little transmission between your drag wheel and the main drag gear. Alright, so throw your drag gear back in. That little tiny gear spinning around. That will interface with your drag wheel. And then now we're going to put in our drag washers. So starting at the back of the line. Now what I screw up in the first time around is I mess up the orientation of this drag washer. The little flaps or the little wings you can see that are on the outside of that drag washer. I had them pointing down. They need to be pointing up. And when I'm testing them out here, they're not really like compressing correctly. They're kind of, there's a space. So on that one drag washer right there with all the little winglets around the outside, make sure those winglets are bent upwards. And when you put all the drag washers back on, they're going to pancake nicely together, and they're going to interface much better. I apologize for the focus. This little camera keeps hunting. Let's put your drag washers back on. Put the top of the spool carrier assembly on top as well, and then get those 4 screwdrivers and tighten it back up. The orientation is pretty self-explanatory. It's kind of foolproof. You'll see there's like a little hole where your little gear for your thumb, your drag wheel goes, and it makes sense. Alright, so now the spool carrier goes back into the body. Now we're ready to start reassembling our main gear. So there's the oscillator. Just make sure the little points are facing outward so the flat side is flush against the main gear. There's our little washer that we didn't want to lose. That goes on the oscillator side of the main gear. And then we can put in our main gear. So there's a little notch on the right side and a little cam on the left. And the cam on the left interfaces with the spool carrier hole, and then the little notch and the link go in on the right side. And this is how your main gear pushes the spool carrier up and down. And this gets you a nice line pattern on your spool. Alright, so there we're putting our spool carrier screw back in. And this is going to tighten the spool carrier to the oscillator and basically connect it to the main gear assembly. So put it down, walk it in, and then we're going to tighten it home. Boom, just like that. Now we can put our bearings back in. I don't know what we want to call these. Maybe the handle shaft bearings, main gear bearings. So on the right side is where the castle nut / bearing retainer goes. And I just take my flathead screwdriver and I just tighten it down using one of the notches. Don't get too buck wild. It's just a retainer. It's not really doing much else. And then I can put my bearing on the other side. There we go. So our main gear and the 2 respective bearings are back in place with the oscillator and the spool carrier attached to the oscillator. Now we can take our handle assembly, take its shaft, push it in, and now we take our crank rod nut, little brass crank rod nut, and tighten that down. We'll get it started with a little screwdriver here, and then boom, tighten it up with our multi-tool. And there's the internals spinning as they should. Nothing feels jammed up, so it should work out nicely. And we're ready to move on. All right, we're going to take our cap, so our crank rod nut cap, screw it back into the body there. Get it started with a small screwdriver, tighten it up with the big dog. Oh, cool. Unless I'm a liar, I think it's time for the back cover. Oh, I lied. So there's our drag wheel. So the drag wheel goes in, and then our back cover kind of locks that in and covers everything. Now we're going to take our main body screws, making sure that drag wheel gear is out of the way. If it is in the way and it's prohibiting your body screws from going in, just turn your drag wheel until the drag gear is no longer an issue. So tighten those up. Be very careful you have the right screwdriver and don't strip them out like I did. I stripped mine, but they still come in and out. Alright, that's how you make note of the orientation of the roller bearing or the clutch. So make sure the shiny side is facing up and the blue side is facing down. There's little notches, just twist it until it goes home. Now we can take our, we'll call it the spinner head bearing, which is an upgrade over the old one, and that goes on the outside of the pinion gear housing. Now lefty tightens it, twist that in. We don't have to get buck wild on it, just hand tighten it, and that keeps your bearing where it needs to be, and it acts as a bushing for your pinion gear shaft. Alright, I'm going to tighten the drag down, and we're going to twist the spool back on. The arrow on the bottom says install, that's counterclockwise. Now we can take our spinner head assembly, make sure you have a good grip on the handle, and tighten it down. And I'm checking, it looks like appropriate orientation and it's spinning freely. So at this point, that's a good indication that we have assembled the reel correctly. Take a small flathead, and we'll just pop that rubber band off. And now I can take my line and feed it through the hole on top of the front cover assembly. Now when I press my thumb button there, you can see the pickup pins retract, and that will allow the front cover assembly to screw on top. So just take our line, we're going to feed it through the little hole on top of the front cover assembly. Make sure the line isn't between the front cover assembly and the main body threads. I have done that before. Then we can pull the line out, test our drag, make sure it's working. It appears to be working. And I'm going to put a little tension on that line, and I'm going to retrieve the line. And lo and behold, it retrieved the line. So this is a good indication that we have assembled the reel correctly. As always, thanks for stopping by. I hope that video was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. Yeah, I know it's winter time, but if you can, make sure you get out and go fishing. See you later. Bye.